As we saw in our video on the 20th of July wound badge, the Nazis really loved themselves some tasty bling, what with the whole a new mythology for a new Germany malarkey. In that video, we also teased that there were way more weird and interesting Nazi medals and awards we could cover, such as the Blood Order medal, which we touted as one of the most prestigious bits of tin that any aspirational armband enthusiast could hope to get pinned upon their chest. And for those of you who were enticed by that prospect, you're in luck today, because the writer of that last piece ended up going down a big Nazi medal rabbit hole after he submitted that last script, and so now, as a result, we're going to tell you all about the medal he hyped up so in that previous video. Let's begin. The Blood Order Medal, or to give it its proper name, the Decoration in Memory of the 9th of November 1923, was, as the name suggests, created to commemorate a very big occasion in Nazi history, and that'd be the so-called Beer Hall Putsch. So big of a deal was that event that to not understand it means that one is unable to gain a full appreciation of the significance of the Blood Order medals. So with that in mind, let's have a once-over of exactly what went down before we get into the medal itself. The Putsch simply meaning coup in English, was the nascent Nazi party's first serious attempt at seizing power in Germany. It was inspired by Benito Mussolini's March of Rome the previous year, in which the big-chinned black shirt had thousands of his goons converge on the capital in a show of force, which prompted King Victor Emmanuel III to appoint Mussolini as Prime Minister without any significant violent clashes. In much the same way, Hitler planned to stage a coup in Munich and then head to Berlin with a view of instigating a nationwide seizure of power. It's worth noting that this plan wasn't hatched by a solitary nutter preaching his extremism on a street corner, as while they certainly weren't exactly a mainstream party, hence the need to launch a coup at all, Hitler and his Nazis were a notable, if small, force in German politics around that time, with the party having around 20,000 members at the time the putsch was undertaken. Some rather notable people were included among that figure too, with a great example being Erich Ludendorff, an old imperial-era general whose support lent major credibility to the early Nazi movement. With that kind of backing behind him, as well as being able to call upon the aid of the Kampfbund, or Combat League, a coalition of aligned nationalists who were always up for a little rumble in the streets, Hitler reasoned that his chances of success were pretty decent. Not guaranteed, make no mistake, but high enough to stop his plan from being a totally mad one. And so, on the evening of the 8th of November, he cast the die. He, along with 600 members of the SA, began by storming the Bürgerbräukeller, one of Munich's largest beer halls, where Bavarian State Commissioner Gustav von Kahr was addressing a large crowd of politicians and businessmen. Then, when through the doors, Hitler wasted no time at all in making his intentions very apparent as he proceeded to fire a single attention-grabbing shot into the ceiling from his pistol and declare that the National Revolution had begun. From there, he, along with Ludendorff and a few heavies, backed Kahr and two conservative leaders into a back room and demanded their support for the putsch. The fact they had pistols pointed at them made Hitler's arguments quite compelling, and so they agreed, outwardly anyway, after which Hitler turned to address the crowd and proclaimed the formation of a new government. So far, so good, right? Well, by that point, yes, all was indeed well with the plan, but soon enough, blunders began to be made. Chief among them, which was the fact that both Hitler and Ludendorff, for some God-only known reason, chose to take Kahr at his word and release him. Naturally, he publicly denounced the putsch immediately, and then raced to mobilise loyal elements of both the police and the military to see it put down. Hitler and Ludendorff were both fully aware that he had done this, but by that point, they were all in, and there was no turning back. Come the morning of the 9th of November then, with no other option as they saw it, they, and a force that had now swelled to 2,000 strong, assembled and began marching towards the centre of Munich, where they hoped to rally popular support and take over key government buildings. But rather than a cheering and adoring crowd eager to stand behind them, they instead found a cordon of armed police who had raced to the scene and locked it down tight in anticipation of their arrival. An attempt was made to encourage the putsch to disband peacefully, but it came to naught, and so a brief but ferocious exchange of fire ensued, in which 16 agitators and 4 police officers were shot dead. Hitler himself fell to the ground amidst the chaos and dislocated his shoulder, but fortunately for him, the same chaos that saw him injured also provided him the perfect cover to escape, and he was spirited away to a Nazi safe house where he was subsequently found and arrested 2 days later. Ludendorff, for his part, saw the jig was up, and in a dramatic display of confidence, it must be said, walked through the gunfire to present himself for arrest without even attempting to abscond or resist. Neither side fired upon him, and he was detained without suffering injury. A swift trial soon followed, and the charge was very, very serious. One, high treason, for which the sentence could be life in prison or even death, should the case be extreme enough. Fortunately for all involved, however, the Bavarian judiciary was a rather conservative thing in those days, and so all brought before the court found themselves treated with considerable leniency. So lenient, in fact, that Hitler even took the occasion as an opportunity to whip out his soapbox and start preaching his ideas, and while doing so, portray himself as but a humble patriot who had been trying to save Germany from communism and the disgrace of the Treaty of Versailles. But while bold, it was an approach that really worked, as Hitler found himself gaining considerable sympathy from both the public, following the trial's reporting, and the judges presiding. As a result, he was given a sentence that can only be considered a light slap on the wrist. Given the seriousness of the crime, he only got 5 years in the rather comfortable Landsberg prison, where he would also write the first volume of his autobiographical manifesto, Mein Kampf. Oh, and if you're wondering what happened to Ludendorff, bugger all would be the answer to that, as by cashing in his reputation as hero of the First World War, he saw all charges leveled against him dropped. So then, you can see why the putsch was a bit of a big deal in Nazi law then. It was the moment when, as they remembered it, Hitler had sought to make a difficult and decisive decision that would save Germany, only to be mowed down by reactionary elements that didn't share his vision and wished to see the nation's economic stagnation and moral degeneracy live on for time immemorial. Further still, however, it also gave the movement its first martyrs, thanks to the 16 party members who lost their life on that day, and what political movement that borders on being a religious one doesn't need some of them? And because doing so gives us the excuse to put some underviewed historical pictures on the screen, here's a list of all 16 of them. Felix Alvarth, Andreas Barriedel, Theodor Casella, Wilhelm Ehrlich, Martin Faust, Anton Heschenberger, Oskar Korner, Karl Kuhn, Karl Lafors, Kurt Neubauer, Klaus von Pape, Theodor von der Pforten, Johann Rickmers, Max Erwin von Schaubner-Richter, Lonza Ritter-von, Stransky Grittenfeld, and Wilhelm Wolff. So revered were they in Nazism, in fact, that they became known as the Blutzeugen, or blood witnesses, with their sacrifice for the movement being so commemorated by elaborate and extravagant annual processions. Further still, when the Nazis came to power, their remains were exhumed, placed within black sarcophagi, and interred within 2 Ehrentempels, or honor temples, that were built in Munich. There, they became the new endpoints of the yearly procession, which, after 1933, would trace the original path from the Bürgerbräukeller to the point where the blood witnesses fell, and then move onwards to their new resting place to pay respects in person. Beyond just martyrs, however, the failed putsch also gave Nazism its first sacred relic, as when Andreas Barriedel was shot, he died atop the party banner he had been carrying, which then naturally found itself stained in his blood. The flag was then pulled from under his body by someone. Exactly who that someone was has been lost to history, and then it was presented to Hitler in 1926. From there, it was given the moniker of the Blutfahne, or blood flag, and showed up at basically any major Nazi event, the putsch commemorations included, and was even used to bless newly produced party flags in the so-called blood flag consecration ritual, oftentimes by Hitler himself, but also by other high-ranking party members. This ceremony was supposed to symbolically transfer the spirits of the fallen martyrs into the new flags, imbuing them with both legitimacy and honour, at least as the Nazis saw it. Given all the hype around the beer hall putsch then, and the Nazis do love a good bit of pomp, so of course a medal was going to be produced to commemorate it. And thus, the Blood Order Medal was born. So let's now move on and have a look at it. And when we say move on to have a look at it, we mean that quite literally, as the medal itself actually has quite the interesting design, as is to be expected, of course. After all, it was no mere West Wall medal to thank Hans and Klaus for knocking a few bunkers together while dodging the front lines. No, this was one of the most prestigious things that a Nazi could ever be awarded. And so, of course, some effort was put into making sure it came out looking particularly well. Let's begin by looking at the back, and as you can see, it features a highly detailed eagle, itself one of the most potent symbols of Nazi iconography, grasping an oak wreath, a long-used German military motif that signifies strength, wisdom, longevity, and loyalty. Within that, we can see the 9 Nov, and beside it, München, 1923 to 1933. Most of that needs no explanation, but the inclusion of to 1933, that one does need some, because of course, the putsch barely lasted for 24 hours just in 1923. In short, it was included to commemorate the Nazis coming to power by legal means. That which began in 1923 was concluded in 1933, that kind of logic. Turning it over now, and looking at the front, we can see the words "Und hier habt dort gesagt" emblazoned around the top edge. This translates to, and after all, you won, and comes from the same rationale that saw them include the year 1933 on the back. Beneath that, we have a big old swastika surrounded by the rays of the sun, which we are sure you don't need explaining to you, and beneath that we have a rather interesting looking building, which is not, as you might first imagine, one of the honor temples. Instead, it's the Feldenhall, or Field Marshal's Hall, a 19th century monument to the Bavarian army. This was included because it was right next to this monument where the shootout between the police and the Nazis occurred back in 1923. And as for the tiny little number you can see stamped below that, that's just the medal's serial number. Simple enough. Do note though, 2 were not numbered, and they were the ones awarded to Hitler himself and to Hermann Goering. Just as fancy as the medal's iconography was its manufacturing, because the first batch was struck in 99% pure silver, while the second one was made out of a lesser, but still by no means cheap, 80% silver. The first batch also carried the hallmark of their manufacturer, a company by the name of J. Fuss München, while the second batch omit this detail altogether. As for how it was worn, regulations prescribed that it was to be worn on the right breast of one's uniform, with the ribbon being either pulled, tied out, and downwards of the buttonhole, or shaped into a rosette of sorts. This position is very notable in and of itself, and was all about demonstrating just how big of a deal this medal was by making sure it was presented on its own without being encroached upon by any other award. You see, German medals, both before, during, and after the Nazi period, were typically worn on the left breast, as you can see on this photo here. By dictating that the Blood Order medal was to be worn this way, the Nazis made sure that no matter how decorated one was, it always stood out loud and proud from the rest. That wasn't something they did just for the Blood Order medal either, as indeed a few of the more prestigious medals and awards were given their own special place to be worn. Take the Ehrenwinkel der Attenkämpfer, or Honor Chevron for the Old Guard, an award for members of the party who joined before they assumed power. It looked much like the rank insignia that would be worn by a Sturman in the SS or a Gefreiter in the army, both roughly akin to a private first class, but was worn on the right arm rather than the left. Consider also the Ritterkreuz der Eisernen Kreuses, or Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, which was awarded for both military valor and or outstanding leadership. It was worn around the neck, and by doing this, again, it was all about making such awards stand out from the rest and making it obvious that they were a big deal. Let's move on now to talk about who was awarded the Blood Order medal, because while yes, it was created to honour the participants of the 1923 putsch, it didn't stay that way forever, and over time morphed into a more general but still very much lauded and exclusive person who did us some solids back before it was cool type medal. The medal itself was established in March 1934 and was first awarded in November of that same year. Annoyingly, we had hoped to tell you exactly who was its first recipient and when they got it, but alas, such information isn't easy to come by, even in the really annoyingly expensive reference books that our writer today is lucky enough to have on his bookshelf. From what information we can find, however, it appears that most of the first batch of 1,500 medals, the really flush 99% silver ones, went to putsch participants specifically, with a few being left over to be issued later when the medal was more widely rolled out. We also believe that the putsch participants got their medals in a very short span of time, as we were able to uncover that one Anton Hermann Falser of the 2nd Company of the Munich SA Regiment was issued his medal, number 864, on November the 9th, 1934, meaning that someone in the middle of the brood received theirs in a matter of days from it being initiated. And while we're on the subjects of there being gaps in our knowledge, if anyone happens to have a copy of Ich Kampf, published by the Nazis in 1944, unlikely for sure, but you never know, please do get in touch, because it's the only book we've been able to find reference to that supposedly has the full list of every Blood Order recipient, and so our writer really needs to get a copy on his shelf. But we digress. Beyond just all that, however, there exist some interesting peculiarities with who was issued the medal as a putsch participant, because it turns out that only 50% of the members were actually paid up members of the Nazi Party. This is due to the fact that under Article 36 of the German Military Code, members of the armed forces were prohibited from joining a political party, and so their participation in the putsch and the various Nazi antics that led up to it had to be done under the table. Hitler and other senior Nazis recognised that this was a moot distinction and cleared them for the medal anyway. Even further still, however, 100 people who were legit not members of the party nor associated with it in any way during the putsch also got the medal, and they were all members of the Munich Infantry School who answered Ludendorff's call to arms on the night of the 8th of November. But as we've already said, with time, eligibility for the Blood Order medal would be expanded. And so, come the end of the Nazi regime, a further 4,500 of them have been awarded, with all except the first few in the queue receiving the lesser quality 80% silver medal. At first, it was opened up to potentially all of the Unterkampfers, or Old Guard, who had been a member of the party since before the 1st of January 1932, but unlike the Honour Chevron, which was an automatic award for such people, in order to be awarded the Blood Order medal in this way, the recipient had to be able to demonstrate both the quality of their Nazi character and a very strong commitment to the cause. And then eligibility was further expanded to include anyone who had been sentenced to death during the Weimar period for pro-Nazi agitation, with those who got it in this manner being those who had later had their capital sentences commuted or had yet to be sent to the rope by the time the Nazis assumed power. This standard was itself later lowered to having spent at least a year in prison for the cause, or having been injured during the line of political duty, again both during the Weimar period. And finally, it was later changed so that later martyrs could be awarded it posthumously, with a notable example being Reinhard Heydrich, who was assassinated in Prague, occupied Czechoslovakia, in June 1942. Hitler himself also got one, as we've already mentioned, although notably he basically never wore it, pretty much only ever bringing it out for the annual putsch commemorations, as you can see here in a photo, which was a real nightmare to track down. As for why he basically never wore it, as we said in our video on the assassination wound badge, he never gave himself military awards, with the only kind of exception to this being the Cross of Honour with Swords, which was a retroactive award given blanket to all veterans of World War I in 1934, but he did give himself a lot of political awards, and so he happily took his Blood Order medal. But since his whole shtick was trying to present himself as but a humble champion of the German people, he only wore specific political awards at specific times for specific reasons, lest he be seen out and about rocking a look that rather undermined the whole humility chic vibe that he was going for. For this reason, he also didn't particularly wear his Cross of Honour with Swords either, and typically you'll only find photos of him wearing his Iron Cross First Class and his wound badge awarded during World War I itself. And having seen the history behind the Blood Order medal and its issuing, as well as its physical design, that's about all there is to tell you about today. Well, it almost is anyway, because there is one small matter of how much one is worth today should you happen across one, and the answer to that depends massively on the infamy of the person to whom it was originally presented. For example, you can usually find one or two for sale at any given time having belonged to comparative nobodies that sell for around the 7,000 USD kind of mark, such as this one. It belonged to one Aloy Dutch, an Austrian chap who used his early alignment with the Nazis to secure himself a rather comfortable bureaucratic job after the Anschluss, and that's about it. Notably too, with his being numbered 3,122, it comes from the second lesser quality badge. As for the ones that belong to a somebody, how about this one. It belonged to a certain Ulrich Graf, who threw himself upon Hitler when the putsch was fired and took about 5 bullets in the process. His doing so was a real crossword in time moment, as in doing so the ascension of Nazism, the outbreak of World War II, and thus the whole world as we know it today, was all but locked into certainty. So while his name might not be up there with Hitler himself or even Goering or Himmler, he is a big deal historically, and naturally this is reflected in the price of his Blood Order medal, which fetched just shy of $40,000 back in 2019. So yeah, if you happen to find one in your granddad's loft underneath his old electrician's helmet, it might be worth resisting the urge to melt it down and just pop it on eBay instead.